Well, good morning. Glad you got up before breakfast and made it. Appreciate that. If you're here for the first time, we have an outline of the whole book of Revelation. Want you to have one free of charge, and you can do what you want to with it. We said we hope you read it. If you have a bird cage, you can put it in there, but I hope you don't. So Paul has some copies, and if you didn't get a copy yet, why, let him know, and he'd be glad to give you one. We have a short period of time to cover a lot of material, so we'll just kind of get started. And while he's passing out, we'll kind of introduce our topic today. The VIPs of history. Several years ago, they built a big reservoir down by our area at Centerville, and the President of the United States came to dedicate it. And we stood there, the 1,000 of us, and we watched the helicopters come. They had two, I suppose they, for safety, didn't know which one the President was in, so you couldn't bomb him out of the sky. This is a long time, in a way, before all the terrorists. And we saw it land, and here came the President, and he stood up on the platform, and I guess that was the first President I ever really saw. It was kind of thrilling. But we had in our congregation a young man named Randy. Randy was such a precocious kid, we thought he would never live to be maybe 15. He tried the lawnmower if it was running one day with his toe and lost part of his toe. He was told by his dad to be careful, and he wasn't. He had a tractor and wagon to go feed the cows, and it was icy, and he flipped it over on himself, and one of the members of the church knocked on my door and said, "Randy's under the wagon." So we lifted the wagon up, and there Randy was, under the wagon, an ear hanging all torn off, but they sewed it back on, and that was Randy. But Randy, when it came time for the President to come, he got away from his parents in maybe 8 or 10, and he went through all that crowd, and he got up clear to the front, and he stood where all the dignitaries were, and when the President came by, he got his hand out there and shook the President's hand. I don't know where the Secret Service were, but he did an unbelievable thing. And then Randy didn't want to wash his hand because he touched the President. Now, the President, to burst your bubble, was Richard Nixon. But I didn't make any difference then, and he's like all men, had good and bad things. The important people of life. We have been studying the book of Revelation, as was said, and we learned that the history part starts in chapter 6 because we have 3 parts. The part that he had already seen, he wrote that. The part that is, which are 7 churches of Asia, plus the throne of God. And then it starts with a white and then a red and a black and a pale horse. And those tell about the different things of the Roman Empire. How that God gave it prosperity, but they couldn't stand it and they fought each other. And then 1/4 of the world died. And you can find this in history. 1/4 of the world died because of the plagues and the sickness and the war that happened. Well, then God did a wonderful thing. God decided that he would give people an opportunity. And after a great persecution, he sent a man named Constantine who changed all the paganism of the empire, and he even made Christianity the state religion, which was bad. I hope they never make the Church of Christ the state religion of America. You know why? It wouldn't mean anything, would it? You can't just force somebody to be a Christian. You can't become a Christian because your wife is and try to just please her. Or because your folks want you to. That doesn't work. It has to come from deep within. And so Constantine made everybody a Christian, offered them white robes if they get baptized, marched his army through the river and said, "Now you're baptized and you're saved." And they weren't any such a thing, but that's just the way it went. But God gave them an opportunity then to evangelize the world for the next decades. And then around 400, God said, "I'm done with the Roman Empire." And we talked about that last night. He sent the hordes of the Goths, the Vandals, and Attila the Hun. Everybody's heard of him. And they conquered the Roman Empire and reduced it to nothing. Now, when you read in the book of Revelation, it says God is punishing 1/3 of the world. You realize that the world was divided in 3 pieces. There was the western part, there was the eastern part, and the African part. And now we are in the part of Revelation where God is punishing the people that have persecuted the church and are going a different direction. Now, we didn't get to the 4th of those trumpets through the last that we had, and that was that finally the sun and the moon are just dark, and that's the end of it. And there was a 4th tribe called the Heruli, led by Odoacer. He walked into Rome because of all the other things that had happened and took over, and the Roman Empire was done. No more Roman Empire, and that was the year 476. Are you familiar with that? If you need to know a date for history, you know 1776? You know that one? You know 1620? You know your birth date? More important, you know your wife's birth date? Not the year, probably. Do you know when you were married? You better. I put out a bulletin like we do at most churches, and I've saved several marriages because, it's our wedding anniversary this week. Whew. Lucked out, didn't he? Just made it. Oh, don't want to forget that. So 476 is a landmark date. That was the end of the Western Roman Empire. But 1453 is the end of the Eastern Empire. And 600 in the middle was the end of the South. So God is bringing an end to the Roman Empire. Empires come and fall, and I've noticed this in history, that we've had, almost every nation had its chance at being great. And they all muffed it, didn't they? You know, Egypt was great once, Greece was great once, Babylon was great once, Assyria was great once, Great Britain was great once. The sun never sat on the Great Britain Empire. It does now. And America got a chance at being great, and where are we in history? I think we're kind of going the way of the rest of them, sad to say. We just don't learn. That when you leave God out and don't honor Him as the one that gave you the blessings, then you'll lose. And Rome certainly didn't honor God, and they lost. Well, we are ready to look at another part of how God punished the Roman Empire. And again, we have a very few minutes, and you have your book. And so I've kind of put it together, and you'll have to maybe read a little bit more. In the next chapter, it talks about a star that fell from heaven. And this star had the right to the bottomless pit, which is satanic. Now that's not a good sign, is it? And there was somebody around this year, around 600, that did start something that's been a scourge ever since. He was a camel driver. Actually, he was supposed to be some kind of a caliph or leader of the people of Arabia, but his dad died and he was raised sort of by his uncle, and he kicked around here and there and became a camel driver, which is sort of like a semi-driver today. He couldn't read and he couldn't write. He never could. But he had the presence of mind at age 25 to marry a 40-year-old woman. Did I tell you she was rich? That was the good part, see. Khadijah was rich, and he was poor. He was a poor truck driver. And he had nothing. He couldn't read and write, but he married this woman who has so much money that he never had to drive another camel if he didn't want to in his life. He could sit around. And he had visions. And the visions were from Allah, who said he is now the prophet, the greatest prophet of all. And he began to talk about it, and they had some wars, and they kicked him out of Mecca, and he went to Medina, and he got an army, came back and conquered Mecca. And he destroyed everything but the big black box. You've seen that on television, maybe? Looks like a big black box sits in Mecca, and they walk around it. I don't know which way they maybe go that. Anyway, they walk around this big black box. It's got a big curtain over it, and inside is a rock. And the rock came from heaven, they said. I suppose it is. It's a meteor. That's sort of like idolatry, I would think. And they all have to make a Mecca pilgrimage. The guy's name was Muhammad. And Muhammad started a religion in 622, well actually when they started fighting, in 622, that went out to conquer the world. They wrote down what he said on twigs and branches and piece of paper and stuff. They put it together in what they call the Quran. He didn't write it. He couldn't write. He was illiterate. But he was smart. Or cagey, or vicious. I don't know which way you want to say it. And so they began to fight. And it tells us here that the people that are pictured here were like locusts. They stung. It hurt. And they had faces like men. You know what a man's face was then? Bearded. The Arabs wore beards. The Greeks and the Romans did not. You ever seen a Roman statue, a guy had a beard? Think about it. Julius Caesar, all those, they have beards. No, they didn't have beards because the Romans shaved. They had Norelcos. And they didn't have those down in Arabia yet or something. And they didn't know how to shave, or didn't shave anyway. And the Jews had beards. But it said something else. They had hair like women. Long hair. You know what I'm talking about. And they did. And they tucked it up under their turbans, and the turbans, it says here, were like crowns. They were gold, and they indeed had yellow turbans that they wore. Interesting that that's exactly a picture. He saw them, and they looked like say, locusts, and they went out in hordes. The locust plague was indeed a terrible thing in Palestine, as you've read different times in Scripture. God sent them, so here's what you get for your sin. And so around 600, I'm saying, is what we're reading here is, and just history begins to go just like God said. We have the Mohammedans coming to do what? Punish the Roman Empire. And maybe more. And that is to punish the people who are taught during this period of 144,000 and also with a great group of Gentiles who were saved. All of these are saved people, meaning that a few Jews, lots of Gentiles were saved in this period of time. Symbolism, remember, it's not an actual count, it's a symbolism of a few and many and all saved. You read that book of Acts, right? Paul go into a synagogue and a few Jews would say, that's what we want. The rest of them say, get out of here. And the Gentiles would say, this is good stuff. Tell us more. And so the churches were a mix of a few Jews and many Gentiles at Corinth and all the rest of the cities. And so they didn't listen. You see, 476 was the fall of Jerusalem, or was the fall of Rome. You know what happened in 531 and 33? You know what happened then? A guy said, I am the head of the church, and you call me the Pope. You know what Pope means? It means Father. You know what Jesus said in Matthew 23? Call no man Father. You know, the right thing to do. But they did it anyway. You see, they didn't pay any attention, apparently, to what they were taught by the Scriptures, and they went their own direction. So God was upset, and He said, we're going to punish all of this world so that they will turn back to me, hopefully. God loves you, and He wants you to serve Him because you know it's right, but if you don't, He'll probably punish you severely. He put Israel in a timeout for 70 years in Babylon. Then they came back, better than they were before. Anyway, they conquered the world, and it says in this chapter that they had power for 5 months. You look at Israel, well, there's not 5 months of anything. They look like, you see the pictures here. You see the faces and going out and myriads of them, and they had 5 months of power. And you wonder, well, what exactly is that? It means nothing in history, except when you understand a prophetic key. In the book of Ezekiel, God told Ezekiel that you're going to lay on the right side for a while and the left side for a while, and you're going to have your food next to you, and you're going to burn human manure. I guess that'd be a nice way to say it. He said, oh, Lord, I can't do that. He said, okay, get cow chips. And that was what he did. Now, can you imagine laying out, no going inside, just lay there on your side and cook these cow chips and do a little oatmeal, something like, and eat that. And they said, what in the world is the preacher doing? I know preachers are weird, but this is really weird. And he said, every day I lay on one side is a year of punishment for you folks. Count up. 1, 2, whatever it is. And so we have a prophetic key that oftentimes in prophetic language, which this book is written in, so that the people of Ephesus would understand, and the Romans would miss it and let it go across to them as John was in Patmos in exile. And so 5 months of 30 days is 150 days or 150 years. Now, is there anything that happened like that? Well, you start out in 622, and they begin to fight, and they go across southern part of the country. They take care of the African part of the Roman Empire. They go up through Palestine. They end up over in Spain. And 100 years later, they face Charles Martel. If that's a name you've heard about before. 100 years later, in 532, they face Charles Martel at Tours. And he stops them. But they're not really defeated. They just stop and they go back and set up the Turkish Empire. And in about 782, or right in that neighborhood, they are telling the rest of the world, we are done fighting. We want to be recognized as part of the world. It was 150 years from when they started to when they stopped and became more peaceful. And then they kind of went into a hiatus, which we'll talk about later. When I was a kid, you know what an Arab was, or an Islamic person was? Some crazy guy on a camel going on in the sand. Didn't mean anything to us. There was no threat. And all of a sudden, where did these guys come from? They came from the book of Revelation. That's where they came from. And all of a sudden, they are a major player of the world, like God said they would be. Anyway, that's what happened. Well, then the next thing that happened is God said, I'm going to destroy the eastern part. We have the western part of the Roman Empire punished. We have the southern part punished by the Islamic people, some call it Mohammedans. And now we have the east. Remember, Constantine changed the capital from Rome to Constantinople. And so that was the power really over here. And they were just doing pretty good. They had a big city and they had big walls, and the Turkish people were growing in power. And there was a guy named Arp Anselm. And on January 29th, I think it was, it's in your book, 1057, they crossed the Euphrates River. Now that's significant because it says here in the next plague that there was a host that was stopped by the Euphrates River and they walked across. Now I don't know why they stopped, but they'd been over here for a few centuries actually, building up this force. And they walked across the Euphrates in 1057. Now they had something that was never ever used before in battle. It says in Revelation, if you read this, that brimstone came out of their mouth and tails were their power. Well, their banners were horse tails. Interesting, isn't it? That they cut off, the first guy that ever did this, come on boys, they didn't want him to cut off his horse tail, put it on a stick and say, come on, let's go. And they thought that's pretty neat. So they put horse tails. The more horse tails you had on your rod, the bigger a guy you were. That was kind of neat, kind of like dried skulls if you're a headhunter, I guess. But anyway, they came across the Euphrates in 1057. You know when they conquered Constantinople? I gave you the date, 1453. That's quite a while, isn't it? But they had one thing, I'm telling you, that nobody had before, and that was the use of gunpowder. They learned that from the Chinese somehow, and they figured out a way to do it, and they had cannons. Now, when I went to Gettysburg, they showed me where the South over here shot way, you've been to Gettysburg before? Where they shot, remember from the woods, shot way over that, looked like a mile or so. I mean, that's a long way to shoot a cannonball. And they were trying to kill all the Union people, but they shot too far, and it went over the top of them and didn't hurt them any. It was amazing. But if you got hit by a cannonball, you'd lose your leg. I figured it just not a big problem. I mean, we done like that. I read about a guy, he wanted to do a trick for a circus, and so he wanted to catch cannonballs. So he practiced. They shot the cannonball, and he reached up and he caught it and lost 3 fingers. Well, he figured out that you can't do that very often. You only got so many fingers, you know. And so he figured out some kind of a myth that he used, and that was his trick for the circus, catching a cannonball shot at him. Now, why you want to do that, I don't know, but some people just do strange things. And he was in Barnum and Bailey Circus for years doing that kind of a thing. Well, they had these cannons. The smallest cannon that they had shot a cannonball 200 pounds. I've seen a cannonball, I could pick it up and, it's nothing. But can you imagine shooting at a wall a 200-pound object? It gets worse or better. The biggest one they had shot 1,200-pound cannon. That's hardly a ball anymore, is it? And so when they finally got to Constantinople and they shot these terrific, powerful things, they easily conquered Constantinople because of the new technology then of warfare. But it took them from 1057 to 1453 to get clear over here. Now, you see, they had a lot of kids and then make a lot of stops. Well, I don't know if that was true. But anyway, it took them a while to get there. And I'm not surprised because God said, you know how long it took them to get there? An hour, and a day, and a month, and a year. And then you begin to calculate that, and the word that we use here for time is daytime, rather than like 24-hour time. So if you take a year, that's 365 days and a piece. What, a 12th? And then you take a month, that's 30. You take a day, that's 1. And you take an hour, and that's 1/12. And you add all that, it'd be at 396 and 1/4, or 3 months. Now you figure out it started in January of 1057, and they conquered on May 29th of 1453 396 years and 4 months later. You get over here and say, now, how do I know in the right spot? Well, it's just uncanny. You can't really miss that. It fits. Everything just comes in place in order like it was supposed to be, and God is punishing these people. You see, these VIPs were either people that punished or blessed, and God uses both. You remember there was a guy named Josiah? Anybody know anybody named Josiah? Ever heard of it? You know Josiah? He a pretty good guy? I think so. I saw he had a shirt on the other day that said Josiah, didn't he? And Josiah was a king. And a prophet said one day Josiah will come here and burn the bones of the priests on this altar. But they all died. But years later, Josiah was born, and he dug them up, and he put the bones on the altar. And that was the way it was God saying, now, this guy Jeroboam, who I gave 10 tribes to, didn't appreciate it, and he went into idolatry. God was upset. And then he talked about my servant Nebuchadnezzar. What a guy he was. If you have Halley's Handbook, you can see his picture. They found a coin with his picture on it. We know what Nebuchadnezzar looked like. And he had a flat nose. He looked pretty mean, I thought, at least on that. And I don't think they'd make him uglier than he was. They made him look better than he was. And he came against the Israelites, and he conquered them, and he was God's punishing tool. And he was quite a guy, wasn't he? And he's a friend of Daniel. And all of that, they worked together. But he was God's man, a pagan, but God's man. And I'm expecting to see him in heaven. Because the Bible says in Romans that if a Gentile lived by his conscience and did the best he can, that's all he has to do in the Old Testament. Did you know that? The Jews lived by the law, but a Gentile lived by his conscience. God says, that's fine with me. I didn't give him any law anyway. If he understands who I am by nature and does the best he can. So you're going to walk down the street and there's old Nebuchadnezzar with his flat nose. Oh, he probably different body, but anyway, you'll probably recognize him. He'll be there, I think. Are you going to be there? That's the question, I really think. Anyhow, that's the way the point was. So these are VIPs. They were punishing the whole of Rome. There is no nation that can thumb their nose at God and get by. For God says the nations are like a drop in the bucket. That's the whole world to God. One drop. He's not buffaloed by what's going on. He's not awed by man's greatness. God is still God, no matter what. But in chapter 10, we have something else. And we have another very important person, and that's an angel. An angel comes in his cloud, and he has fiery feet, and in his hand he has a little book, and it's open. And he stands with 1 foot on the sea and 1 foot on the land, with his book being opened. Now, we are getting sort of toward the Middle Ages and in that part of time. And what happens as we go along in history? After we get past the Dark Ages and all that, well, what happens is the Bible, the open book, begin to be circulated once again. We will read, and hopefully we can get to it in our next message, that there was a period of the Dark Ages where this thing was in sackcloth and it was suffering and wasn't circulated. But now he's saying, John, because the last verse says, John, you'll prophesy again before nations and tongues. And you know what that means? The Bible will start to be translated into all kinds of languages. And that began to be happening around 1200 and past. Now, we have some early versions of the Bible. We have, within the year 150, an Egyptian translation of the New Testament. That's pretty early. That's how we know the Bible is the Bible, because we can go back so far. And there it is, just like we would have it today. Jerome, who you may have heard of, in around the year 400, went to a cave. It was the cave Jesus was born in. When I was a kid, I saw a manger made out of wood and all that. I go to Bethlehem. If you've gone there, you know what I'm talking about. And you go down the stairs, and there's the cave with a gold star on the bottom where Jesus was born. I don't know if that's for sure or not, but that's where Queen Helena, Constantine's mother, said it happened, and that was sort of within the time that they might know. Be that as it may, Jesus was probably born in a cave where they kept cattle. Lots of caves in Palestine, by the way. Now, Jerome came over there, and he sat in that cave for 25 years, translating the Bible. The Old Testament Hebrew, the New Testament Greek into Latin, which would do us a lot of good, wouldn't it? Oh, great. And that became the official language of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, in order for these Jews and these Romans and others who are part of the Ephesus church to understand what we're talking about, in the 13th chapter, John said, now here's what wisdom can figure out. What I'm talking about is 666. Okay. So, what? Well, if you were a Roman, you would know this, and that is that every letter had a numerical equivalent. You know, like a clock, I is 1, V is 5, X is 10, and L is 50, I guess, and C is 100, and M is not 1,000,000, 1,000, I think. Anyway, like this. And so the letters had, what they would do is they'd write letters, and then they would give them numbers, and the total number would be something. And there's some word, some name, that the total of it is 666, but it's something they would know. It couldn't be something way off in the future. It'd be something they would know, because every once in a while he checks it. Now, I might have lost you, John says, but you can check this. This name is 666. And he's talking about Rome. And it appears to me that the name they would know is Latinos, the founder of the Latin Empire. And Latin was the language of those people. And so Jerome put the Bible in Latin. And for the next, 1,000 years probably, that was the only Bible you could have. But others said, we need to spread this Bible. And he's talking here about John will begin to speak to everyone. Now, it says all languages, right? Latin is just one. My mother was a school teacher, and my grandma was a school teacher, and my mom said, you've got to study Latin. So I took Latin in junior high, I think it was. Oh, man. It killed Caesar and about killed me too. It was terrible. I mean, Caesar runs all over the world. You can get a translation of it, not have to worry about translating it. But that's, and I thought that was crazy. But my mom was with me and helped me translate Caesar and all that kind of stuff. And I'm kind of glad that happened, because so much of our language is built on Latin and Greek. If you know language, you can just guess on a lot of words, and it means more to you. But Latin was the thing. When I was a kid, if you went to the Catholic Church, guess what it was all in? Latin. I don't know if people understood anything or not. It wasn't important. You didn't have to know that. You just went through the cross and all that, and you were saved and put a little oil on, and you were fine to go. I mean, that was just all there was to that. They would understand that we're talking about the Latin Empire, and so he wrote the Bible in Latin. But then others said, we need the Bible in something else. And so along came Martin Luther. And Martin Luther had some problems, I understand, but I take my hat off to Luther, because he did some marvelous things in the situation he was in, and he did a great, great job of trying to bring people back to at least something. And he believed in sola scriptura, which meant Bible only. And if his followers would have been as good as Luther, we'd have had a different story. But anyway, beside that, he was called into the diet of worms. Or they say worms in Germany. And that was like a judgment. And they said, you're writing these books and we don't want you to write them, and you have to discredit them. And he said, if you can prove it by the Bible, I'll throw them all away and I'll repent. But they couldn't. See, he was objecting to what was going on in that day, and it was going on wrong. And so they had a plot to capture him. But his friend Frederick kidnapped him. And nobody knew where Martin Luther was. He was in a castle, in a German castle. Nobody knew. But they had a new gardener, who they didn't know who it was, kind of a little plump round fellow. And he would do the gardening, but in most of the time, Martin Luther was in this castle translating the Bible from the Latin, not the original German or Greek necessarily, from the Latin into German. And so what was said here, the Bible will now go to other languages. That's 1500, you see. But what about us? Well, we were having trouble over in England. We didn't have any English Bible at all. And Wycliffe said in about 13-something that we need this Bible, and Tyndale followed him too. But the forces of England did not want a Bible. So Tyndale and Wycliffe did it anyway. And Tyndale said, I want to translate the Bible to English so that the common plowboy will know as much of the Bible as the king would know. Isn't that the thing? I mean, everybody should know the Bible. But they didn't like it very well. And Wycliffe fooled him. He died. They couldn't get him. Tyndale, well, he tried to escape, but he was turned in. And the interesting thing about it, he printed, it was, pretty poor what he had. He printed the best he could. Movable type had come in, and they smuggled it in by cotton bales and all kinds of stuff, and then they would find them and they'd burn them. Now, can you imagine Christian people burning the Bible? I mean, it's supposed to be. You find Islamic people burning the Quran? Well, no. I mean, it's kind of odd, isn't it? Something is wrong with the so-called Christian people who would be burning the Bible. They apparently aren't really Bible people. And so, one guy said to Tyndale, he said, you know what? I know who would take all those Bibles and could do something with them. He said, who? He said, well, the Bishop of London. He said he'd burn them. I know. He said, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a hold of these from you, because they're not very good, well printed, and I'm going to give them to him at a big price, and he'll think I'm a hero because I got all these Bibles, and he'll burn them, and you'll have a bunch of money you can print better and more. So the Bishop of London furnished the money for the better printing of Bibles and didn't even know it. And God is just marvelous how He works. But they killed Tyndale anyway. Burned him at the stake, and he prayed, Lord, open the King of England's eyes. And it wasn't long until the English Bible was circulated. They had the Geneva Bible. And then King James said, we need a Bible that people will all agree on. So he wrote and had translated the King James Version. Now you see, John, you're going to prophesy again. It's just like he said, after we get all this other stuff done, the Bible is going to be recirculated, and it's going to be great. Now you know when the King James Bible was put out, don't you? 1611. King James never signed off on it. King James was not a good man. Anyway, but they translated this, and the Pilgrims said, we're headed to America. But you know what else they said? We're not taking that corrupted old King James Version. It's too new. And wanted the king anyway who persecuted. So they took the Geneva Bible. There was not a King James Bible on the Mayflower. They wouldn't take the thing. It was just too off. Can you imagine the revered King James? Rejected by the early Americans. But anyway, it served its purpose. And other versions have come, and some good and some not. And you gotta use your head on all of that. But God said it's going to happen. We quit at 10:10. And we have quit. So you have an outline, and we're just noticing that God takes us through history in a marvelous way. You can trust Him. He takes care of business, but not at your speed. Understand that? Not when you think. He's not a push button. And if He were, you'd kick the machine because the pop isn't coming out in time. Trust God. Believe in Him. And God bless you for listening. I appreciate that.